I'm Shelley Tart, 22, and I earned my place in the U.S. Navy after months of brutal training. For years, I held my family together, working jobs as a teenager, handing over every paycheck, carrying weight they pretended not to see. But at my own pass and review, when they mocked me in front of everyone, "She's still a deadbeat to us," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or betrayed by the very people you sacrificed for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being torn down, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there long before I ever stepped foot on that base, long before I raised my right hand and swore an oath that would change everything. My family had a way of making their disapproval known without ever saying it directly. It lived in the spaces between words, in the way conversations stopped when I walked into rooms, in the forced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. When I first mentioned the Navy, my mother set down her coffee cup with that particular precision she reserved for moments when she was about to deliver judgment. "That's nice, honey," she said, but her tone suggested it was anything but nice. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. Just a grunt that could have meant anything or nothing at all. The comments started small. Casual observations that felt like paper cuts. "You know, most people your age are settling down," my sister would say during family dinners. "Building real careers." The emphasis on real was never subtle. My brother would chime in with statistics about military dropouts, delivered with the kind of concern that wasn't concerned at all. They wrapped their skepticism in worry, their doubt in love, but I could feel the sharp edges underneath. I tried to explain what the Navy meant to me. The structure, the purpose, the chance to serve something bigger than myself. They nodded along, made appropriate sounds, but I could see them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The kind of glances parents share when their child announces they're running away to join the circus. Indulgent. Patronizing. Temporary. "It's a phase," I heard my mother tell my aunt on the phone one evening. I was supposed to be upstairs, but her voice carried through the thin walls of our house. "She'll figure it out soon enough. You know how she gets with these ideas." These ideas. As if my decision to serve my country was comparable to the time I wanted to learn the guitar, or when I briefly considered studying abroad. Another whim in a long line of whims they'd watched me abandon. They were already planning my return, already preparing the "we told you so" speeches they'd deliver with false sympathy when I came crawling back. Boot camp was a relief. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who understood what I was trying to accomplish. The drill instructors were hard, but their harshness had purpose. It was designed to build something, not tear it down. When they yelled, it was because they were pushing me toward a goal we all shared. When my family criticized, it felt like they were pushing me away from something they couldn't understand and didn't want to try. I wrote letters home because I was supposed to. Short updates about training, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. Their responses were equally brief. My mother would mention neighbors, grocery prices, the weather on their end. My father would add a line or two about work. No one asked how I was handling the physical demands, if I was making friends, whether I was proud of what I was accomplishing. It was as if I'd disappeared into a parallel universe they couldn't quite believe in. The graduation ceremony was still weeks away when I sent the invitations. I'd designed them carefully, chosen the paper that felt substantial in your hands, written out the details in my best handwriting. "You are cordially invited to attend the pass and review ceremony." It felt important, formal, like something that mattered. I wanted them to see that this wasn't temporary, that I'd found my place. My mother called the day after she received hers. "Of course we'll be there," she said, but something in her voice made my stomach tighten. It was the same tone she'd used when agreeing to attend my high school graduation parties she clearly didn't want to go to, or family gatherings that felt more like obligations than celebrations. The words were right, but the music underneath them was wrong. "It means a lot to me that you'll be there," I said, testing the waters. "We wouldn't miss it," she replied, and I could practically hear the "even though" hanging in the air after her words. "Even though we don't understand why you're doing this. Even though we think you're making a mistake." even though we're still waiting for you to come to your senses." My father got on the phone briefly. "Proud of you, kiddo," he said, but it sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been coached to say. There was no follow-up question, no curiosity about what I'd learned or how I'd changed. Just the appropriate words delivered with the emotional weight of a grocery list. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than I had since arriving at boot camp. These people who were supposed to know me best seemed to understand me least. They were planning to attend my graduation not because they were proud, but because showing up was what families did. They'd sit in those stands and watch me march, but they wouldn't see me. Not really. They'd see their daughter playing dress-up in a military uniform, acting out a fantasy they were politely enduring. The weeks leading up to the ceremony felt different after that call. Every accomplishment, every milestone, every moment of pride got filtered through the knowledge that the people who were supposed to celebrate with me were just counting down the days until this phase ended, and I came back to being the person they expected me to be. I started imagining their conversations on the drive to the base. How they'd probably spend the time rehearsing the things they'd say to other families, practicing their supportive parent faces for the cameras, preparing to play their roles in what they saw as my elaborate charade. They'd smile and nod and say the right things, but underneath it all would be that patient waiting, that certainty that time would prove them right and me wrong. But I was wrong about one thing. They weren't planning to wait patiently. They weren't going to smile and nod and keep their doubts to themselves. They had something else in mind entirely, something that would turn what should have been my proudest moment into something I'd remember for all the wrong reasons. The signs were all there, but I was too focused on the ceremony ahead to read them correctly. I thought their reluctance was about not understanding my choice. I had no idea they were actively planning to undermine it. On the morning of my graduation, as I pressed my dress blues and prepared for the most important day of my military career, my family was getting ready too. Getting ready to make sure I knew exactly where I stood with them, ceremony or no ceremony. Getting ready to remind me that some things never change, no matter how many oaths you take or uniforms you wear. The day I'd been working toward for months was about to become the day everything changed between us forever. The morning of my pass and review ceremony, I woke up before dawn with the kind of nervous energy that makes your hands shake when you try to tie your shoes. This was it. The culmination of everything I'd worked for, every push-up I'd struggled through, every order I'd followed, every moment I'd questioned whether I was strong enough or smart enough or dedicated enough to make it through. My dress blue uniform hung perfectly pressed on its hanger, every ribbon and device positioned according to regulations I could recite in my sleep. I'd spent the previous evening going over every detail, checking and double-checking that everything was correct. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about representing something bigger than myself, about earning the right to wear symbols that meant something. The other recruits were quiet that morning, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what this day meant. For some, it was about family legacy, following in the footsteps of fathers and grandfathers who'd served. For others, it was about proving something to themselves or to people back home who doubted them. For me, it had become about showing my family that their daughter wasn't the person they thought they knew. I'd transformed over the past weeks in ways that went far beyond the physical. Yes, I was stronger, faster, more disciplined than I'd ever been. But the real change was deeper. I'd found something inside myself that I didn't know existed, a capacity for commitment, for seeing something through even when it was harder than I'd imagined. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to believe in my own abilities, to stop seeking validation from people who were never going to give it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the people I most wanted to impress were the ones least likely to be impressed. My drill instructors had already told us we'd earned our place here. The ceremony was a formality, a celebration of something we'd already accomplished. But I still needed my family to see it, to witness this moment of transition from who I used to be to who I was becoming. They arrived an hour before the ceremony, parking their rental car in the designated family area with the precision my father brought to everything he did. I spotted them from across the parade ground as they climbed out, my mother smoothing her dress, my father checking his watch, my siblings looking around with the kind of tourist curiosity that suggested they were visiting a foreign country. From a distance, they looked like what they were supposed to be, a proud military family attending their daughter's graduation. My mother had chosen a conservative blue dress that would photograph well. My father wore his good suit, the one he reserved for weddings and funerals and occasions that required formal respect. My brother and sister flanked them, appropriately dressed, appropriately present. But I knew them well enough to read the signs that others couldn't see. The way my mother's smile seemed painted on, lasting exactly as long as she thought someone might be watching. The way my father kept checking his phone, as if he had somewhere more important to be. The way my siblings stood slightly apart from our parents, like they were maintaining plausible deniability about their association with this event. I watched them find their seats in the family section, watched them nod politely to other families, watched them perform the role of supportive relatives with the kind of practiced competence that comes from years of showing up to events you don't really want to attend. They were good at this dance, good at looking like they belonged, good at saying the right things to the right people. What I couldn't see from my position was the conversation they were having among themselves. The quiet comments, the shared looks, the way they were preparing for what came next. I assumed they were nervous, maybe uncertain about protocol, possibly even feeling a little proud despite their reservations. I assumed they were processing their own emotions about watching their daughter take this step into adulthood. I was wrong about all of it. As the ceremony began and we marched onto the parade ground in perfect formation, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with the moment itself. The sound of our feet hitting the ground in unison, the weight of the uniform on my shoulders, the knowledge that I'd earned my place in this line of sailors, it all combined into something that felt bigger than any doubt or criticism or conditional love. The dignitaries took their places on the platform. The commanding officer delivered remarks about service and dedication and the honor of wearing the uniform. Everything proceeded according to the program I'd memorized, each element building toward the moment when we'd officially become what we'd been training to become. But even as I stood at attention, even as I focused on executing every movement with precision, part of my mind kept drifting to the stands where my family sat. I couldn't see their faces clearly from my position, but I could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. After all these weeks of independence, of learning to trust my own judgment and believe in my own capabilities, I was still that daughter seeking approval from parents who'd never learned how to give it. The ceremony reached its midpoint, and I allowed myself to feel a moment of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, whatever my family thought or said or did, I'd accomplished something real. I'd kept promises to myself and to the Navy. I'd proven that I could commit to something difficult and see it through to the end. That had to count for something, even if the people in the stands couldn't see it. But as we moved into the final phases of the ceremony, as the moment approached when families would join us for photos and congratulations and celebrations, I started to feel a familiar anxiety creeping in. The same feeling I'd had before family dinners when I knew someone was going to bring up my phase, before phone calls when I knew I'd have to defend my choices, before any gathering where I'd have to justify my decisions to people who'd already decided I was wrong. The difference was that this time, I wasn't going to be alone with them. This time, there would be witnesses. Other families, other sailors, officers who'd watch how my family treated me and draw their own conclusions about what kind of person I was and where I came from. That should have been protection. That should have meant they'd be on their best behavior, that they'd save their criticism for private moments, that they'd at least pretend to be proud in public. It should have. But I was about to learn that some people's need to express their disapproval is stronger than their sense of appropriate timing. As the final commands were given and we prepared for the moment when ceremony would give way to celebration, I had no idea that my family had already decided how this day was going to end. Not with pride, not with congratulations, not with any acknowledgement of what I'd accomplished. They had other plans entirely. I should have known better than to expect unconditional support from people who'd never given it before. I should have prepared myself for the possibility that they'd find a way to diminish this moment, just like they'd diminished every other achievement I'd thought might finally make them proud. But I was still young enough, still hopeful enough, still naive enough to believe that some occasions were too important to ruin. That even my family wouldn't dare spoil something this significant. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. Growing up in our house, I was the one who made things work when they weren't working. Not because I was the oldest or the most responsible by nature, but because I couldn't stand the tension that hung over everything when problems went unsolved. While my siblings found ways to disappear when bills piled up or when my parents' voices started rising behind closed doors, I stayed in the middle of it, trying to fix whatever was broken. I was 14 when my father lost his job the first time. Not laid off, not downsized, fired for what my mother called personality conflicts, and what everyone else understood as his inability to keep his opinions to himself when his supervisor made decisions he disagreed with. The house got quiet in that specific way that meant money was tight, where conversations stopped when I entered rooms and my parents spoke in code about things they thought I was too young to understand. But I wasn't too young to see the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen counter, or to notice that we'd stopped going out to dinner on Fridays, or to hear my mother on the phone with her sister, voice strained as she explained why they couldn't come to Christmas dinner that year. I wasn't too young to understand that something needed to be done and that the adults in charge weren't doing it. So I got a job. 15 years old with a work permit and a determination to contribute something useful to the household finances. I told my parents it was because I wanted to save money for college, which was true enough, but mostly it was because I couldn't stand watching them pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I worked after school and weekends at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves and dealing with customers who treated teenage employees like they were barely human. The work was boring and the pay was minimal, but every 2 weeks I'd bring my paycheck home and hand it over to my mother, keeping just enough for lunch money and school supplies. "You don't have to do this," she'd say every time, but she always took the money. Always folded it carefully and put it in her purse with the kind of relief that told me exactly how much we needed it. My father never said anything about my contribution, never acknowledged that his 15-year-old daughter was helping keep the lights on, but he never told me to stop working either. That pattern continued through high school. My father would find new jobs and lose them with predictable regularity, sometimes for legitimate reasons, but more often because he couldn't adapt to workplace politics or accept direction from people he didn't respect. My mother worked part-time as a receptionist at a doctor's office, but her income was barely enough to cover groceries, let alone rent and utilities and all the other expenses that kept accumulating. So I worked, and I contributed, and I watched my siblings find ways to avoid being part of the solution. My brother got heavily involved in sports, which gave him legitimate reasons to be away from home most afternoons and weekends. My sister discovered drama club and choir and student government, activities that required her full attention and energy. They were building their own lives, creating their own identities separate from our family's financial struggles. I could have done the same thing. I was smart enough for honors classes, social enough for student activities, capable enough to find my own escape routes. But every time I considered joining something that would take time away from work, I'd think about those unpaid bills or the worried conversations between my parents or the way my mother's face looked when she was trying to figure out how to make the money last until the next payday. The worst part wasn't the work itself or even the sacrifice of typical teenage activities. The worst part was that my family treated my contribution as both essential and invisible. They needed my help, relied on it, structured their budget around it, but they never talked about it directly. It was like I was a silent partner in keeping our household functioning, acknowledged through necessity, but never through gratitude. When my friends complained about their parents' rules or restrictions, I wanted to tell them about working 20 hours a week while maintaining a 3.8 GPA, about choosing shifts over social events, about the adult responsibilities I'd taken on while they worried about curfews and allowances. But I also knew that talking about it would make my family look bad, would expose problems we were all pretending didn't exist. So I kept quiet and kept working and kept believing that my loyalty would eventually be recognized, that my sacrifice would eventually matter to them in some measurable way. I thought I was building something with them, creating a foundation of mutual support that would last beyond whatever immediate crisis we were navigating. I thought they understood that I'd chosen them over easier paths, that I'd put their stability ahead of my own interests, that I'd proven my commitment to our family in ways that should have mattered. I thought that when the time came for them to choose between supporting me and judging me, they'd remember everything I'd given up for them. I thought wrong. By the time I graduated high school, I'd been contributing to our household expenses for 3 years. I'd given them every paycheck, covered car repairs and utility bills and emergency expenses without being asked, without expecting praise, without keeping score in any way they could see. I'd shown up for them consistently, reliably, without conditions or complaints. But that wasn't the story they told about me, and it wasn't the person they saw when they looked at me. In their version, I was someone who drifted from one interest to another, someone who made impulsive decisions, someone who needed their guidance to find direction. They remembered the part-time jobs as phases I'd gone through, the financial contribution as something temporary I'd done while figuring out what I really wanted. When I told them about the Navy, they didn't see someone who'd proven her ability to commit to difficult things. They didn't see someone who understood responsibility or who could be counted on when things got hard. They saw their daughter having another moment of uncertainty, trying on another identity that wouldn't last any longer than the others. The years I'd spent putting their needs first had taught me about loyalty, about sacrifice, about what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself. But it hadn't taught them to see me as someone capable of making serious decisions about her own life. That disconnect, that fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I'd already proven, was about to come crashing into the most important moment of my military career. The daughter who'd kept their lights on was about to discover that some people's capacity for gratitude has very definite limits. And those limits were about to be tested in front of hundreds of people on the most significant day of my young adult life. The ceremony was proceeding exactly as rehearsed, each element falling into place with military precision. The commanding officer had delivered his remarks about honor and service. The guest speaker had talked about the proud tradition we were joining, and now we stood in perfect formation as the final phases began. Everything felt solid, established, real in a way that made the doubts and criticism of the past few months seem small and distant. I'd found my rhythm in the ceremony's formality. The structured movements, the predictable sequence of events, the shared purpose of everyone on that parade ground, it all combined into something that felt like belonging. For the first time in my life, I was part of something that operated according to clear principles, where expectations were stated directly and achievements were recognized openly. The families in the stands represented all kinds of stories. Some were multi-generational military families where service was a tradition passed down like family recipes. Others were first-generation military, parents who'd never set foot on a base before today, but who radiated pride as they watched their sons and daughters in uniform. There were grandparents with faded photographs of their own service, spouses holding babies who would grow up hearing stories about this day, siblings taking pictures to share with friends back home. Looking at those families from my position in formation, I could see the emotions written on their faces. Pride, certainly, but also wonder and gratitude and a kind of awe at being part of something so much bigger than any individual story. These people understood that what they were witnessing mattered, that their loved ones had accomplished something significant, that this moment deserved their full attention and respect. My own family was harder to read from where I stood, but I could see them in their designated section, sitting appropriately, looking like they belonged among all the other proud families. From a distance, they appeared to be playing their parts correctly. My mother had her camera ready, my father was paying attention to the proceedings, my siblings were present and accounted for. What I couldn't see was the subtle communication happening between them. The way my mother would lean slightly toward my father during certain parts of the ceremony, the way my sister would catch my brother's eye at specific moments, the way they were all maintaining what looked like respectful attention while actually preparing for something else entirely. I'd gotten good at reading my family's moods and intentions over the years, but military bearing required me to keep my eyes forward, to maintain focus on the ceremony itself rather than scanning the crowd for approval or disapproval. It was actually a relief not to be able to study their faces, not to be analyzing every expression for signs of what they were really thinking. The ceremony moved into its final phases, and I could feel anticipation building not just in our formation but throughout the crowd. This was the moment everyone had come to see, the official completion of our transformation from civilians to sailors, the formal recognition of what we'd accomplished, the beginning of whatever came next in our military careers. As the commanding officer prepared to dismiss us to join our families, I felt a complex mix of emotions that I wasn't sure how to name. Pride, obviously, but also something like vindication. I'd done this thing they doubted I could do. I'd committed to something difficult and seen it through to completion. I'd proven something to myself, even if I hadn't proven it to them. But underneath the satisfaction was still that familiar anxiety about their reaction, that old need for their approval that I couldn't seem to shake entirely. I wanted them to see what I'd accomplished and recognize it as real, as valuable, as something worthy of their respect. I wanted this moment to change the dynamic between us, to shift me from someone who needed their guidance to someone who deserved their pride. The dismissal came with the sharp authority of every military command I'd learned to respond to instantly. Dismissed. And suddenly the formal structure of the ceremony dissolved into something more chaotic and human as families rushed onto the parade ground to find their sailors, to take pictures, to celebrate together. I turned toward the section where my family had been sitting, expecting to see them making their way down from the stands like everyone else. Instead, they were already standing at the edge of the parade ground, having positioned themselves where they could intercept me as soon as the formation broke. But something was wrong with the picture they presented. While other families were smiling, hurrying, showing obvious excitement about reuniting with their graduates, mine stood in a tight cluster that looked more like a delegation than a celebration committee. They weren't moving toward me, they were waiting for me to come to them, and there was something in their posture that made my stomach tighten. I walked toward them with as much confidence as I could manage, my dress blues feeling heavier with each step. Other families around us were hugging, taking pictures, talking excitedly about the ceremony and what came next. The energy was celebratory, joyful, full of the kind of pride that doesn't need to be performed because it's completely genuine. But as I got closer to my own family, I could see that they weren't caught up in that general atmosphere of celebration. They were having their own conversation, their own experience, their own reaction to what they'd just witnessed. And it wasn't the reaction I'd hoped for. "There she is," my mother said as I approached, but her tone was flat, neutral, carrying none of the warmth or excitement I could hear from other families around us. It was the same tone she might have used to announce that the mail had arrived or that dinner was ready. Factual. Unemotional. Distant. My father nodded in my direction, but didn't move forward for a hug or handshake or any other gesture of congratulation. My siblings flanked them like backup singers, present but not participating, watching the interaction unfold without contributing to it. "How did it look from out there?" I asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into a conversation that felt like it was starting at the wrong temperature entirely. "Very impressive," my mother replied, but something in the way she said it made impressive sound like criticism rather than praise. Like she was commenting on a performance rather than acknowledging an achievement. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't going to be the reconciliation I'd imagined, the moment when they finally saw me clearly and recognized what I'd accomplished. This was going to be something else entirely, something that would make the ceremony itself feel like the easy part of the day. They had things to say to me, and they'd been waiting for exactly this moment to say them. Not privately, not later, not in some context where we could work through our differences like adults. Right here, right now, in the middle of my celebration, surrounded by hundreds of other families who were managing to be proud of their children. I could see it in their faces, in the way they were positioned, in the energy that surrounded them like a force field. They'd come to my graduation not to celebrate with me, but to make sure I understood that graduation didn't change anything between us. That I was still exactly who they thought I was, uniform or no uniform. Other graduates around us were laughing with their families, posing for pictures, making plans for celebration dinners. Normal families doing normal things after their children had accomplished something significant. But my family had different plans entirely. They'd come to deliver a message, and they were about to make sure everyone could hear it. I should have recognized the setup. The way they stood in formation like a tribunal rather than scattered casually like a family. The way they'd positioned themselves at the edge of the crowd where voices would carry. The way they all seemed to be waiting for the same signal to begin whatever they'd planned. But I was still thinking like their daughter rather than like someone who needed to protect herself from them. still hoping for pride instead of preparing for an attack. Still believing that some moments were too sacred to destroy, even for people who'd made careers out of destroying my confidence. I was about to learn that there are no moments too sacred, no achievements too significant, no venues too public to stop some people from making sure you know exactly how little they think of you. The ceremony was over, but the real test was just beginning. The first blow came wrapped in what sounded like casual conversation, delivered with the kind of practiced cruelty that comes from years of finding the most effective ways to cut someone down. My mother turned to my father, speaking just loud enough to ensure I could hear every word, and said, "Well, at least she finished something for once." The words hit like cold water. Here I was, still feeling the pride of completing one of the most challenging experiences of my life, surrounded by hundreds of families celebrating their loved ones' achievements. And my own mother was treating my graduation like a minor surprise rather than a meaningful accomplishment. But that was just the opening move. My siblings exchanged a look that I'd seen countless times before, the look that meant they were about to pile on, about to turn a single cruel comment into a coordinated attack that would leave me feeling completely isolated and defeated. "I still can't believe she actually made it through," my sister said, loud enough for nearby families to hear. I kept expecting a phone call saying she'd quit. My brother laughed. Not the kind of laugh that suggests something is funny, but the kind that suggests something is ridiculous. Same here. I had money on her being home within a month. They were standing in a circle around me now, not physically threatening, but emotionally cornering me, making sure I couldn't escape the conversation they'd planned. Other families moved around us in their own celebrations, but we'd become a pocket of tension in the middle of all that joy. "You know what I told people when they asked about her joining the Navy?" my father said, and I could already feel where this was heading. "I told them it was just another phase. Like when she wanted to be a veterinarian. Or when she was going to study abroad. Remember that?" They all nodded, building the momentum of shared memory that they'd used to dismiss every major decision I'd ever made. Every dream I'd shared with them, every goal I'd worked toward, every time I'd tried to explain what mattered to me, it all became evidence of my inability to stick with anything long enough for it to mean something. "The difference is, this phase cost us money," my mother added, and several people nearby turned to look at us. All those visits during training, the phone calls, the travel to get here. And for what? That's when I realized this wasn't spontaneous cruelty. They'd planned this. They'd coordinated their attack, decided on their talking points, prepared their strategy for making sure my graduation day became about my failures instead of my achievements. They'd sat in those stands during the ceremony not feeling proud or worried or even neutral, but mentally rehearsing the ways they were going to tear me down as soon as they got the chance. "She's still a deadbeat to us," my father said, and his voice carried across the parade ground with perfect clarity. Several conversations around us stopped. Other families turned to stare, trying to understand what they were witnessing, trying to process the fact that someone's own family would choose this moment, this place, this occasion to deliver that kind of judgment. But my family was just getting started. They'd waited months to deliver this verdict, and they were going to make sure I heard all of it. "All that training," my sister said, "all that pretending to be something she's not, and she's still the same person who couldn't hold a job, couldn't finish college, couldn't make a decision and stick with it." The laughter that followed was the worst part. Not the bitter laughter of people who were angry, but the satisfied laughter of people who thought they were being clever, who thought they were delivering some kind of necessary truth that I needed to hear. I stood there in my dress blues, feeling the weight of every ribbon and device I'd earned, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd accomplished, listening to my own family explain to anyone within earshot why none of it mattered. Why I was still the same failure I'd always been, just dressed up in a costume that didn't change the fundamental reality of who they believed me to be. Other families were taking pictures, making dinner plans, talking about how proud they were and how much their children had grown. My family was conducting a public execution of my character, using my own graduation as the platform for explaining why I'd never amount to anything significant. The worst part wasn't even the content of what they were saying. It was the timing, the venue, the complete lack of awareness or care about how their words might affect me or the people around us who had to witness this destruction. They'd turn my moment of triumph into their opportunity for revenge against every time I'd disappointed them, every decision I'd made that they disagreed with, every way I'd failed to be the person they wanted me to be. I could feel other families watching us now, could see the confusion and discomfort on their faces as they tried to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't how these ceremonies were supposed to go. This wasn't what families did when their children accomplished something difficult and meaningful. But my family had their own rules, their own priorities, their own need to make sure I understood that nothing I did would ever be enough to change their fundamental assessment of who I was and what I was worth. They'd come to my graduation not to celebrate with me, but to make sure everyone knew that the uniform didn't change anything, that the achievement didn't matter, that I was still the same disappointing daughter I'd always been. And they were making sure that message was delivered as publicly and as humiliatingly as possible, in front of hundreds of people who'd gathered to celebrate accomplishment and service and the beginning of new chapters in young people's lives. My family had turned my new beginning into their final word on why I'd never be worth being proud of. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed this would be like every other time they'd torn me down, every other occasion when I'd absorbed their criticism and internalized their disappointment and worked even harder to try to earn their approval. They hadn't considered that I might have changed during those months of training, that I might have developed new sources of strength and confidence that didn't depend on their validation. They were about to discover that some things actually can change people, and that uniforms sometimes represent transformations that go much deeper than what shows on the surface. But first, they had to finish their performance. They had more cruelty to deliver, more ways to make sure this day would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. And then something happened that none of us had planned for, something that would change the dynamic completely and show everyone present exactly what kind of people they really were. Standing there absorbing their coordinated attack, feeling the eyes of other families on us as my graduation became a public humiliation, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. This wasn't about my military service or my ability to commit to difficult things or any of the specific criticisms they were leveling. This was about power and control and their need to make sure I never grew beyond their ability to diminish me. Every decision I'd made that took me further from their influence, every achievement that suggested I might not need their approval or guidance, every sign that I was becoming someone independent and self-directed. It all threatened the version of our family dynamic where I remained the person who needed their judgment and direction to find my way in the world. The Navy represented the ultimate threat to that dynamic. Not just because I'd succeeded at something they'd predicted I would fail at, but because I'd found a whole new source of identity and purpose that existed completely outside their control. I discovered that other people could see value in me that my family couldn't or wouldn't recognize, and that discovery made their opinion feel less essential than it had ever felt before. But they weren't going to let go of that control easily. If they couldn't prevent me from succeeding, they could at least make sure I understood that success didn't change their fundamental assessment of who I was. They could use this public moment to reassert their authority over my sense of self-worth, to remind me that no matter what I accomplished, I was still subject to their judgment. The problem was that their strategy depended on me responding the way I always had, by absorbing their criticism, by trying to defend myself, by getting pulled into an argument that would prove their point about my immaturity and poor judgment. They expected me to react emotionally, to give them more ammunition, to turn their attack into a back and forth that would justify everything they were saying about my character. But something had changed during those months of training. I'd learned discipline that went beyond following orders or completing physical challenges. I'd developed a kind of internal steadiness that didn't depend on external validation, a sense of my own worth that couldn't be shaken by other people's opinions, even when those people were my own family. So instead of defending myself or arguing back or trying to convince them they were wrong, I just stood there and let them continue their performance. I watched other families celebrate around us. I felt the weight of my uniform and the meaning of what I'd accomplished, and I waited for them to finish saying whatever they'd come here to say. That restraint, that refusal to engage with their attack, seemed to frustrate them more than any argument could have. They'd prepared for battle, and I wasn't giving them one. They'd expected tears or anger or some kind of breakdown that would prove their point, and instead I was showing them exactly the kind of military bearing they claimed I'd never be able to maintain. "Are you even listening?" my mother demanded, her voice rising enough to draw even more attention from nearby families. "This is exactly what we're talking about. You tune out whenever anyone tries to tell you something you don't want to hear." But I was listening. I was hearing every word, understanding exactly what they were trying to do, and choosing not to participate in the destruction they'd planned. I was making a decision about who I wanted to be in this moment, and it wasn't the person they expected me to be. That's when my father decided to escalate. "You know what this is really about," he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground with perfect clarity. "She thinks putting on a uniform makes her better than us. She thinks she's proven something. But we know who she really is." The families around us weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. Some had stopped their own conversations entirely, staring openly at this spectacle of a family destroying their own daughter's graduation day. I could see confusion and disgust on their faces, could see them trying to understand what kind of people would choose this moment for this kind of cruelty. But my family was committed to their performance now, feeding off each other's energy, building to whatever climax they'd imagined would finally put me back in my place. "She's still a deadbeat to us," my father repeated, louder this time, making sure everyone in the immediate area could hear. "Uniform or no uniform? Ceremony or no ceremony? She's still the same person who couldn't stick with anything long enough for it to matter." That's when the laughter started again. That satisfied sound of people who thought they were delivering necessary truth, who believed they were performing some kind of public service by making sure everyone knew not to be impressed by what they'd just witnessed. The laughter carried across the parade ground, cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a discordant note in a symphony. Other families turned to stare, trying to understand what they were hearing, trying to process the fact that someone's graduation day was being turned into this kind of public humiliation. But what my family didn't realize was that their performance was being witnessed by more than just random families with cameras and proud smiles. Military ceremonies don't just happen in front of relatives and friends. They happen in front of military leadership, distinguished guests, people whose opinions carry weight in ways that extend far beyond family dynamics. And one of those distinguished guests had been watching our little drama unfold with increasing interest and concern. I didn't see him approaching at first, focused as I was on maintaining my composure while my family continued their coordinated attack. But other people saw him, and I could feel a shift in the energy around us, a sudden tension that had nothing to do with our family conflict and everything to do with the presence of someone whose authority commanded immediate attention and respect. My family was so committed to their performance that they didn't notice the change in atmosphere around us. They were still building momentum, still feeding off each other's cruelty, still convinced that they were delivering some kind of necessary correction to my inflated sense of achievement. They had no idea that they were about to be corrected themselves by someone whose opinion would matter to everyone present in ways theirs never could. The moment that changed everything started with a simple request for the microphone. The ceremony's official program had concluded. Families were scattered across the parade ground in their individual celebrations, and most people assumed the formal proceedings were over. But distinguished guests at military ceremonies have certain privileges, and one of those privileges is the ability to address the crowd when circumstances warrant it. I was still standing with my family, still absorbing their continued criticism, when I became aware of movement near the platform where the ceremony's officials had been seated. Someone was walking purposefully toward the microphone, someone whose presence immediately commanded attention from everyone on the parade ground. At first, I assumed it was an administrative announcement, information about parking or scheduling or some other practical matter that needed to be communicated to the assembled families. Military events are full of logistics, and there's always something that needs to be clarified or corrected or explained. But as this figure approached the platform, I realized that what was happening was much more significant than a routine announcement. The way other military personnel responded to his presence, the immediate attention he commanded from everyone within sight, the sense that something important was about to happen, it all suggested that this wasn't standard operating procedure. My family was still deep in their performance, still delivering their verdict on my character and achievements, still making sure everyone around us understood their position on my military service. They were so focused on their own agenda that they didn't notice the shift in energy that was rippling across the parade ground. But I noticed. And I could see other families noticing too, turning their attention from their individual celebrations toward the platform, sensing that something significant was about to occur. The voice that came through the speakers was clear, authoritative, and immediately recognizable to everyone present who understood military hierarchy and protocol. This wasn't just any distinguished guest. This was someone whose presence at the ceremony represented the highest levels of recognition and respect for what we'd accomplished. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice began, and conversations across the parade ground immediately stopped. Families turned toward the platform, graduates came to attention, and suddenly hundreds of people were focused on whatever was about to be said. "I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment," the speaker continued. "I know the formal ceremony has concluded, and I know you're all eager to celebrate with your families. But there's something I need to address, something I've witnessed here today that requires immediate attention." My family finally stopped talking. Not because they understood the significance of what was happening, but because the voice from the speakers was too loud to talk over, and they'd been raised with enough basic social awareness to stop their conversation when someone with a microphone was speaking. But they still didn't understand what was coming. Still didn't realize that their public performance had attracted exactly the kind of attention they hadn't planned for. Still thought this was some routine military business that had nothing to do with them. "During my many years of service," the voice continued, "I've had the privilege of attending countless ceremonies like this one. I've watched thousands of young people complete their basic training and begin their military careers. I've seen families respond to their loved ones' achievements in every way imaginable." The pause that followed felt heavy with intention, like the speaker was choosing his words carefully, building toward something specific. "But I've rarely seen anything as inspiring as what I've witnessed from one particular graduate today," he continued, and I felt my stomach tighten as I began to understand where this might be headed. In the face of criticism that would have broken the spirit of many people, in response to treatment that no service member should ever have to endure from their own family, I've watched one of our newest sailors demonstrate exactly the kind of character and dignity that makes me proud to have served in the same uniform. The silence across the parade ground was complete now. Hundreds of people listening, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after the routine elements of the ceremony were forgotten. My family finally grasped that this announcement had something to do with them, had something to do with their performance, had something to do with the fact that their private family business had become very public indeed. But it was too late to stop what was happening, too late to take back their words, too late to pretend they hadn't spent the last several minutes publicly humiliating their own daughter at what should have been one of the proudest moments of her life. The distinguished guest wasn't finished. He had more to say, and everyone present was going to hear it. "I want everyone here to look at Shelley Tart," the voice from the platform commanded, and suddenly hundreds of pairs of eyes were focused on me. Not on my family, not on the drama that had been unfolding around us, but on me specifically, on the person in the dress blue uniform who had somehow become the center of this unexpected moment. I felt the weight of all that attention, the significance of being singled out in front of so many people, the surreal experience of having my personal family conflict transformed into something much larger and more public than I'd ever imagined possible. "There," the speaker continued, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, "is what dedication looks like. There is what honor looks like. There is what it means to serve something larger than yourself, even when the people closest to you refuse to recognize the significance of that service." The words hit like a physical force. Not just because of what was being said, but because of who was saying it, because of the context in which it was being said, because of the hundreds of witnesses who were hearing every word. My family stood frozen beside me, finally understanding that their private performance had become very public indeed, that their casual cruelty had attracted exactly the kind of attention they'd never intended to draw. But the speaker wasn't finished with his assessment. "In my experience," he continued, "the measure of a person isn't found in the support they receive from others, but in how they conduct themselves when that support is absent. It isn't found in the praise they get for their achievements, but in their commitment to excellence even when their achievements are dismissed or diminished. Each word felt like it was chosen specifically for this moment, specifically for this situation, specifically to address what everyone present had witnessed during my family's coordinated attack. Shelley Tart has demonstrated today that she understands something that some people never learn, that true honor comes from within, that real character doesn't depend on external validation, and that the uniform she wears represents values that transcend family politics or personal disappointment. The platform was elevated enough that I could see the speaker clearly now, could see the authority in his bearing, the significance of his presence, the weight that his words carried with everyone present. This wasn't someone offering casual encouragement or routine congratulations. This was someone whose opinion mattered at levels my family couldn't even imagine. I want everyone here to understand, he continued, that what you've witnessed from this young woman today, her composure under attack, her dignity in the face of cruelty, her commitment to honor even when honor isn't being shown to her. These are exactly the qualities we need in our military, exactly the characteristics that make someone worthy of the uniform they wear. The silence was absolute now. Hundreds of people absorbing what they were hearing, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be talked about long after this ceremony was forgotten. My family stood beside me like statues, finally grasping the magnitude of what they'd done, finally understanding that their private cruelty had become public judgment, that their casual dismissal of my achievements had attracted the attention of someone whose opinion carried infinitely more weight than theirs ever could. But the speaker had saved his most pointed observation for last. And I want to say directly to the family members who chose this moment, this place, this occasion to tear down rather than build up, to diminish rather than celebrate, to attack rather than support, the pause that followed was loaded with judgment. You have shown everyone present exactly who you are and exactly what your opinion is worth. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread across the entire gathering. This wasn't just recognition of my character, this was public condemnation of theirs. This wasn't just praise for my achievements, this was explicit criticism of their response to those achievements. My family's faces were no longer masks of satisfied cruelty. They were portraits of people who'd suddenly realized they'd made a terrible miscalculation, that their private family dynamics had exploded into public humiliation, that their moment of power over me had become their moment of powerlessness in front of hundreds of witnesses. The laughter was gone. The satisfied smirks were gone. The coordinated attack was over, replaced by the dawning understanding that they'd just been judged by someone whose authority made their opinions seem petty and small and ultimately irrelevant. Shelley Tart, the voice concluded, represents everything we hope to see in our service members. Her family's inability to recognize that says nothing about her character and everything about theirs. The applause that followed wasn't polite ceremony applause. It was the kind of sustained, passionate response that comes when people witness something that moves them, something that speaks to principles they believe in, something that restores their faith in human dignity and honor. But I barely heard it. I was too busy watching my family's faces change, watching them realize that their moment of triumph had become their moment of judgment, watching them understand that everyone present had just heard an authoritative assessment of who they were and what they represented. The power dynamic between us had shifted completely and permanently. Their ability to diminish my achievements, to question my character, to make me feel small and inadequate. It had evaporated in front of hundreds of witnesses who'd just heard someone with real authority explain exactly what my service meant and exactly what their response to it revealed about them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing alone against their judgment. I was standing with the support of people who understood what I'd accomplished, who recognized what I represented, who saw value in me that my family had never been able to see. The moment was too significant, too public, too witnessed to be taken back or explained away or dismissed as just another family disagreement. This had become something permanent, something that would define our relationship from this day forward. My family's power over me was broken, and everyone present had seen it happen. The aftermath of that public recognition was immediate and uncomfortable for everyone involved. The applause eventually died down, the distinguished guest left the platform, and the ceremony's official proceedings were truly concluded. But the atmosphere around our little family group had changed completely, and there was no pretending otherwise. Other families began to approach us, not to intrude on private business, but to offer congratulations and support. Parents who'd watched the entire drama unfold wanted to shake my hand, to tell me they were proud of what I'd accomplished, to make sure I knew that not everyone agreed with what they'd witnessed from my own family. "That was beautiful," one mother said, her eyes slightly damp with emotion. "What he said about you, that's exactly right. You should be so proud." Her husband nodded in agreement. In all my years attending military ceremonies, I've never seen anything like that. "The way you handled yourself, that was real class." Their teenage daughter, who'd probably attended dozens of these ceremonies for various family members, looked at me with something like awe. "I can't believe they said those things to you. But the way you just stood there and didn't let them get to you, that was amazing." More people approached with similar messages. Veterans who understood military culture and what the distinguished guest's intervention meant. Other graduates who'd witnessed the entire sequence of events and wanted to express their support. Families who'd been horrified by what they'd seen and wanted to make sure I knew that my own family's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. Each conversation was brief, respectful, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. I'd spent years believing that my family's assessment of me was accurate, that their disappointment was justified, that their lack of pride in my achievements reflected some fundamental failure on my part. But here were dozens of strangers, people with no agenda, no history with me, no reason to lie or exaggerate, telling me that what they'd witnessed was courage, dignity, and honor in the face of treatment that no one should have to endure from their own family. My family, meanwhile, stood in increasingly uncomfortable silence as this parade of support continued. They couldn't leave without making their humiliation even more obvious, but they couldn't participate in conversations that were explicitly about how poorly they'd behaved. They were trapped in a situation they'd created, forced to witness the very recognition and respect they'd tried to prevent me from receiving. The most difficult conversation came from a woman who introduced herself as a Gold Star mother, someone who'd lost a child in military service. She approached with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from profound loss and personal understanding of what military families sacrifice. "I wanted you to know," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "that what you showed today, that strength, that composure, that's exactly what we need in our military. Your family doesn't understand what they have in you, but the rest of us do." She paused, looking directly at my parents. "I lost my son in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He died serving his country, serving something bigger than himself. If he were here today, he'd be proud to serve alongside someone like you." The weight of her words, the authority that came from her sacrifice, the implicit criticism of a family that couldn't appreciate what they had while she'd lost what she valued most, it rendered everyone speechless. My mother tried to respond, to say something that might salvage the situation or explain their behavior, but what could she say? How do you justify publicly humiliating your daughter at her military graduation to a woman who'd lost her child in service to the same cause? The Gold Star mother turned back to me. "Don't let anyone make you question what you've accomplished here," she said. "Don't let anyone diminish what you've chosen to do with your life. Some people will never understand service, sacrifice, or honor. That's their limitation, not yours." She walked away, leaving my family to absorb the full impact of what she'd said, to understand that their behavior had been witnessed and judged not just by casual observers, but by people who understood military service at the deepest, most personal level. As the crowd began to disperse and families started leaving the parade ground, my family faced a choice they hadn't anticipated. They'd come to my graduation with a plan to put me in my place, to make sure I understood that my achievements didn't change their assessment of who I was. Instead, they'd been publicly identified as the kind of people who tear down rather than build up, who attack rather than support, who diminish rather than celebrate. They could try to salvage the situation with apologies or explanations, but everyone present had heard too much, seen too much, witnessed too clear a demonstration of their character for words to make much difference. Or they could double down on their position, maintain their criticism of me, and accept that they'd be forever known as the family who couldn't find it in themselves to be proud of their daughter's military service. The choice they made in that moment would define our relationship for whatever came next. But for the first time since they'd arrived, the choice was entirely theirs. I was no longer seeking their approval, no longer dependent on their validation, no longer willing to sacrifice my own sense of worth for their comfort. The daughter who'd kept their lights on, who'd worked to support their household, who'd put their needs ahead of her own interests for years, was finally done trying to earn something they'd never been willing to give. The ceremony was over, but the real transformation was just beginning. In the days that followed my pass and review ceremony, I waited for the phone calls. The awkward apologies, the attempts at explanation, the careful words designed to repair what had been broken so publicly and completely. My family had always been skilled at damage control, at finding ways to smooth over conflicts, at crafting narratives that made their behavior seem reasonable or justified. But the calls didn't come. Not that day, not the next week, not in the months that followed. What had happened on that parade ground wasn't the kind of thing that could be fixed with a conversation or explained away with good intentions. Too many people had witnessed it, too much had been said, too clear a line had been drawn between who they were and who I'd chosen to become. Instead, I got silence. Not the comfortable silence of people who understand each other without words, but the heavy silence of people who've said things that can't be taken back, who've revealed themselves in ways that can't be undone, who've damaged relationships beyond their ability to repair. My first duty station was across the country, which made the silence easier to maintain. Geographic distance became emotional distance, and the practical challenges of staying in touch provided convenient excuses for the lack of communication that everyone seemed to prefer. Occasionally, I'd get updates through extended family. Casual mentions of what my parents were doing, how my siblings were progressing through their own lives, the kind of general information that gets passed along family networks without requiring direct contact between the people involved. But there was never any acknowledgement of what had happened at my graduation, never any reference to the public humiliation they'd orchestrated, never any recognition that their behavior had created a permanent change in our family dynamic. Instead, I heard complaints. Indirect criticism passed along by aunts and cousins who'd been recruited to express my family's ongoing disappointment in my choices. They thought I was being stubborn by not reaching out. They believed I was holding grudges unnecessarily. They wanted me to understand that families should be able to move past disagreements, that military service shouldn't come between parents and children. The irony was perfect. The same people who'd publicly declared that my achievements didn't matter, that my service was meaningless, that I was still a deadbeat regardless of what uniform I wore. These same people wanted me to prioritize family relationships over the principles they'd spent years telling me were worthless. They wanted forgiveness without acknowledgement, reconciliation without responsibility, relationship without respect. They wanted me to come back into their orbit as if nothing had changed, as if their public judgment of my character was just another family disagreement that time would smooth over. But something fundamental had shifted in me during those moments on the parade ground. Not just the external validation from the distinguished guest or the support from other families, though both of those mattered. The real change was internal, the recognition that I didn't need their approval to know my own worth, didn't need their pride to feel proud of what I'd accomplished, didn't need their understanding to move forward with confidence. My military career progressed exactly as it should have. Good performance evaluations, increasing responsibilities, the respect of my peers and supervisors. I found mentors who understood what service meant, friends who shared similar values, communities where dedication and honor weren't treated as phases or temporary interests, but as fundamental characteristics that defined who you were. The contrast was stark. In my professional life, I was surrounded by people who recognized and valued the qualities my family had dismissed. In my personal life, I was free from the constant need to justify my choices to people who were never going to approve of them anyway. But the absence of family relationship left its own kind of emptiness. Not because I missed their criticism or needed their validation, but because I missed what we might have been if they'd been different people, if they'd been capable of pride instead of resentment, celebration instead of attack, support instead of sabotage. I missed the family I'd never had more than I missed the family I'd actually grown up with. Years passed. Promotions came. I deployed overseas, served in roles that carried real responsibility, earned recognition for contributions that mattered in measurable ways. The girl who'd been called a deadbeat at her own graduation became a petty officer, then a senior petty officer, then someone whose opinion was sought by junior sailors facing their own challenges with families who didn't understand military service. I became the person I'd needed when I was standing on that parade ground absorbing my family's coordinated attack, someone who could recognize value that others couldn't see. Someone who understood that family disapproval doesn't diminish individual achievement. Someone who knew that the people closest to you aren't always the people most capable of seeing who you really are. Occasionally, I'd run into people who'd been at my graduation ceremony. Other military families whose paths crossed mine at various bases, veterans who remembered the incident, people who'd witnessed what they still described as one of the most powerful moments they'd ever seen at a military ceremony. I still think about what happened that day, one father told me during a chance encounter at a commissary. The way you handled yourself, the way that dignitary stood up for you, it changed how I think about family support and what it really means to honor your children's achievements. These conversations reminded me that what had felt like personal humiliation at the time had actually become something larger, a public demonstration of principles that resonated with people, a moment that illustrated values worth defending, a story that gave other people language for their own experiences with unsupportive families. My graduation had become less about my individual achievement and more about the universal struggle between people who tear down and people who build up, between families that diminish and families that celebrate, between love that demands conformity and love that supports growth. In the end, my family's attempt to diminish my achievement had inadvertently elevated it, had turned what should have been a routine graduation into something memorable and meaningful for hundreds of people who'd witnessed it. Their public judgment of my character had become a public demonstration of their own limitations, and everyone present had drawn their own conclusions about which of us represented the values worth admiring and emulating. The silence that followed wasn't just their choice. It was mine too. I'd finally learned to stop seeking validation from people who weren't capable of giving it, to stop trying to earn respect from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting, to stop sacrificing my own sense of worth for relationships that diminished rather than enhanced who I was becoming. The ceremony had ended years earlier, but the real victory was just beginning. Today, when junior sailors come to me with stories about families who don't understand their service, who criticize their choices, who treat military achievement as somehow less valuable than civilian success, I tell them about my graduation day. Not as a cautionary tale about family relationships, but as an example of something more important, the moment when external validation becomes internal strength, when other people's limitations stop defining your possibilities, when you finally understand that honor comes from within. I tell them about standing in dress blues while the people who were supposed to be proudest of me explained to everyone within earshot why I wasn't worth being proud of. I tell them about the silence that followed, the years of distance, the choice between seeking approval from people incapable of giving it and building a life based on principles they'd never understand. Most importantly, I tell them about the moment when someone with real authority looked at that situation and identified exactly what was happening, exactly who deserved respect and who deserved judgment, exactly what values were being demonstrated by whom. The people who can't see your worth, I tell them, aren't the people whose opinion should matter to you. The uniform you wear means something to people who understand service, sacrifice, and honor. Don't waste energy trying to convince people who've already decided not to see what you've accomplished. Some of them nod and seem to understand immediately. Others need time to process what it means to separate self-worth from family approval, to build identity around principles rather than relationships, to choose growth over comfort. But all of them benefit from knowing that someone else has stood where they're standing, has faced the choice between family acceptance and personal integrity, and has chosen integrity without regret. My career continued to progress in ways that would have been impossible if I'd remained tethered to people who couldn't recognize my potential. Leadership roles, overseas assignments, responsibilities that challenged me in ways my family never could have imagined. Each promotion, each new opportunity, each recognition of my capabilities felt like vindication of the choice I'd made on that parade ground years earlier. The woman my family had dismissed as a deadbeat became someone whose opinion was valued by commanding officers, whose leadership was trusted by junior sailors, whose service contributed to missions that mattered in ways they'd never understand. But the real measure of my success wasn't professional achievement or military recognition. It was the internal quiet that came from no longer needing their approval, no longer questioning my worth based on their assessment, no longer carrying their disappointment as evidence of my failure. I'd learned to distinguish between people who add value to your life and people who subtract from it, between relationships that support your growth and relationships that limit your possibilities, between love that builds up and behavior that tears down. The family that had mocked my service at my graduation ceremony had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: freedom from caring what they thought, independence from their judgment, liberation from the exhausting work of trying to earn something they were never going to give. The silence between us wasn't something to be fixed or resolved or apologized for. It was something to be grateful for, something that created space for better relationships, something that allowed me to become the person I was meant to be without the constant weight of their disapproval. When people ask if I ever miss having family support, I tell them I found something better: the support of people who understand what I'm trying to accomplish, who share similar values, who celebrate achievement rather than diminish it. When they ask if I ever regret choosing military service over family harmony, I remind them that families worth having don't require you to choose between personal growth and their approval, don't make you sacrifice your dreams for their comfort, don't turn your proudest moments into their opportunities for cruelty. The lesson I learned on that parade ground, the one I carry with me and pass on to every junior sailor who struggles with unsupportive family, is simple: sometimes the people closest to you aren't the people most capable of seeing who you really are. Sometimes choosing yourself over their version of you is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. The ceremony ended decades ago, but the transformation it began continues every day. Every time I choose growth over comfort, principles over approval, integrity over relationship, I honor what that moment taught me about what really matters and who really matters in building a life worth living. My family never learned to see the value in what I'd chosen to do with my life. But I learned something more important: how to see that value for myself, how to protect it from people who would diminish it, and how to build a life around people and principles that enhance rather than limit who I'm capable of becoming. That's the real victory, the one that matters long after the applause fades and the ceremonies end and the uniforms are carefully stored away. The victory of becoming yourself despite the people who think they know better, of choosing honor despite the people who can't recognize it, of building something meaningful despite the people who insist it doesn't matter. The daughter they dismissed as a deadbeat became a woman they could never have imagined, serving in ways they never understood, contributing to something bigger than they ever dreamed possible. And the best part is, I finally stopped needing them to see it. That was the day I learned I didn't need my family's approval to know my own worth. Their silence afterwards spoke louder than any of their words ever could. What about you? Have you ever had to celebrate a big win without the support of the people you thought would stand by you? Did it change how you see them, or how you see yourself? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the reminder: your value isn't defined by who refuses to see it.